Several followers recommended that I listen to this group called Roupa that a lot of people are comparing to the American rock band Toto. I listened to a few of their songs and I really loved them. I took a poll of my Instagram followers and I asked, which one of these two songs that I had picked out do you think I should make a video about? And there was an overwhelming response. I got so many messages with everybody saying the same thing. Neither. Instead, you've got to listen to the song Sapato Velho, which from what I understand means old shoes. And I've got to say, this is a really good song. I want you to listen to the first verse. By the way, sadly, I do not speak any Portuguese, but I did take a Portuguese lesson so that I could do my best to sing this song for you. Você lembra daquele tempo, tinha estrelas nos olhos, jeito de herói. Era mais forte e veloz que qualquer mocinho de cowboy. Now, I know a lot of people are comparing this group to the band Toto, but it actually reminded me of a different American rock group, one of my favorite groups of all time, Chicago. Does anyone else hear that with the chord progression and melody writing? Let me know in the comments if you hear that too. The song starts off with an interesting device called a pedal tone. A pedal tone is when we have one note that stays the same while the chords change, and it's usually in the bass. So take a listen over here. I've got an A in the bass, and in my right hand the chords are changing from A to D major to E major. Now if I just play the three chords A major, D major, and E major, it's not terribly interesting by itself. But if I add this A pedal tone in the bass while it's changing, listen to how much it adds. And then we add that melody on top of it. Você lembra. Now the chords that come next are not too unusual until we get to a little bump in the road. What we have is a descending bass line like this. And we have these chords that match it. What's unusual is that we expect the next chord in the series to be an E major chord in first inversion. That would sound like this. But instead we get something a little bit different. Instead of that E major chord in first inversion, we get a G sharp diminished chord. Now the bass note is the same. It's G sharp no matter which chord we do, but here's the difference. Here it is with what we expect, that E major chord. And instead here it is with the diminished chord that they use. I'm bringing this up because in this first verse, there are actually 3 different times where we expect to hear this E major chord in first inversion. And every time they avoid it and they go to something else that's a little bit surprising. We'll come back to that in a moment. The next thing we have is another surprise diminished chord, and I'm going to show you exactly why and how it's being used. By the way, if you're enjoying this video, please take a moment to subscribe to my channel. Now this part of the chord progression could have just stopped on the F sharp minor 7 chord like this. But instead of just staying on that F sharp minor chord, it gets prolonged by going back and forth from F sharp minor to F diminished and back to F sharp minor. And so it sounds like this. Why prolong that F sharp like that? Well, there are 2 reasons. The first is that harmonically, it tonicizes the F sharp minor chord. What that means is it makes us sound like we are temporarily in a different key, in the key of F sharp minor. You might be able to hear that it almost sounds like we're in F sharp minor right now. And part of that is because of the diminished chord that we added. But here's the other thing. This piece has some unusual mixed meter in it, meaning that if we start counting beats, we're not going to get the standard 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 that we expect in Western music. Instead, in this verse, we'll get 6 plus 6 plus 4 plus 4. So I'm going to sing the first part of this, and I'm going to show you the beats with my fingers. And you'll see that instead of reaching 4, I'll reach 6 counts before I go all the way back to 1 again. Você lembra daquele tempo eu tinha estrelas. Now the next chord we get to is my favorite in the song. In fact, this type of chord rarely appears in pop music, but when it does, it's almost always my favorite chord of that song because it has such a special role. Listen to what this chord sounds like first, and then I'll tell you about it. Now, if you're a guitarist, you might be looking at lead sheet notation that describes this as a B major chord, over an A in the bass. In classical music, we would call this a 4-2 chord. But what it really means is that there's a dominant 7th chord. In this case, it's B7. And instead of putting the 7th of the chord all the way up here, I'm going to put it down here on the bass. Why is this chord so special? Well, everything about this chord tells it that it has to resolve in a very specific way. If I just play a B7 chord like this, our ears are telling us that we expect it to resolve to an E major chord. But notice that when I play it like this, I'm putting the 7th in the top. And the 7th needs to resolve down. Our ears really expect that 7th to go down. So we get this sound. But what happens when I put the 7th in the bass? The 7th still needs to resolve down. We still expect it to resolve down, but now it's resolving down in the bass. And since we know how the bass needs to resolve, and we know how the chord needs to resolve, if we know a little bit about music theory, we know that this chord must resolve, theoretically, to an E major chord in first inversion. And it sounds like this. In fact, when I hear those two chords back to back, I always hear that first chord as having a tremendous amount of pressure, like a buildup that needs to be released. And how does it release? Into this chord. But there's just one thing. The chord that it needs to resolve to is that same chord I mentioned earlier. The one that's getting expected, but then rejected 3 times in this first verse. And just like in the first time, we hear the bass go down just as we expect, but the chord does not do what we expect. Instead of resolving to an E major chord in first inversion, this time we go to a G sharp minor chord. Estrelas nos olhos, jeito de herói. By the way, notice what the melody is doing. Often when we get such beautiful and interesting and kind of complicated chord progressions, it's balanced out by the melody actually outlining the notes in the chord. So the first chord gets outlined, then we land on a chord tone walking down, and the next chord gets outlined. The next part is a repeat of some material we've already heard. There's our G sharp diminished, the third and final time in this verse that we're denying that E major chord in first inversion. But what's happening differently in this time is we get this really nice continuation of the bass walking all the way down. We get this F natural, and the melody we can hear resolving. Forte veloz que qualche mocinho de cowboy. I'm constantly listening to new songs. I'm getting requests to listen to and talk about songs from all over the world all the time. And some songs, it takes me a little bit of time. I have to hear it a few times before I really can get it. This song, the very first time I heard it, I knew I was going to love this song. What do you think? Is this a song that you grew up with and you already knew about? Do you like it? If it's new to you, what did you think the first time you heard it? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more videos just like this one. Você lembra daquele tempo, tinha estrelas nos olhos, jeito de herói, era mais forte e veloz que qualquer mocinho.